Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Fossil Hunter, Dinosaurs, Evolution, and the Woman Whose Discoveries Changed the World, by Shelley Emling, narrated by Rachael Beresford. Prologue. She sells seashells on the seashore. The shells she sells are seashells, I'm sure. For if she sells seashells on the seashore, then I'm sure she sells seashore shells. Tongue Twister, written by Terry Sullivan in 1908, and inspired by Mary Anning. Pre-Victorian England exemplified a powerful period in the history of science, a time when one never-before-seen monster after another was being cajoled from its Jurassic tomb, drawn out into the light of day where it could blow holes through the biblical account of the Earth's history. These creatures, with their bat-like wings, snake-like necks, and big, bulging eyes, vividly brought to life a prehistoric era that was more bizarre and harrowing than anyone had ever imagined. Indeed, they forever changed the way people thought about the world around them. Today, it is hard to relate to the mindset of people living in the early 19th century, decades before dinosaurs burst onto the scene. Without question, most people accepted the idea of an Earth created in 6 divinely ordered 24-hour time slots in 4004 BC, a year derived at by meticulously tracing the biblical genealogies. After creating the sun, moon, stars, and oceans, God made creatures of the air, sea, and land on day 5, followed by the appearance of the most magnificent and most complex creature, man, on day 6. The land animals harmoniously shared the garden with Adam and Eve, and all were vegetarian until the first couple sinned, and thus began meat-eating and mortality. Later, during Noah's time, the global flood decimated all life, except for that which had been corralled into his ark. Fossilized seashells found on mountaintops were proof positive of a deluge so great it swept up and over everything in its path. In the early 1800s, most people had absolute faith in the fact that species never changed or evolved, or became extinct. Everything that existed had always existed. The world was pretty simple, really. There wasn't any radioactivity or relativity, extinction or evolution to muddle things up. It was during this time that a young working-class English girl named Mary Anning began raising eyebrows with her daily forays along the dangerously crumbling strata of England's southern coastline, decked out in voluminous tattered skirts as she ran the gauntlet of high tides and landslides. Always she was on a hunt for curiosities she could sell to seafaring tourists in order to put food on her table. By birthright, Mary should never have grown up to be a famous fossil hunter and geologist. In addition to being dirt poor, Mary Anning also was marginalised by odds clearly not stacked in her favour. Her sex, regional dialect, lack of formal education, and adherence to the dissenter faith, a religious strain that didn't conform to the teachings of the established Church of England. But she enjoyed one powerhouse advantage, the very good fortune of having been born in exactly the right place at the right time. In 1799, in an unassuming English town called Lyme Regis, alongside some of the most geologically unstable coastline in the world. Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, its wobbly cliffs held the remains of a baffling array of ancient reptiles that used to roam the land and inhabit the seas hundreds of millions of years in the past. I first discovered Mary Anning a few years ago during a vacation to England's so-called Jurassic Coast, with my husband and 3 children. My 10-year-old son Ben is quite the budding geologist, who likes nothing more than to wait for low tide, then scramble out across the shore below vertical yet slumping cliffs, hoping to chance upon an ammonite in a greyish stone streaked with quartz. During our brief trip, we paid a visit to the small Lyme Regis Philpott Museum, where, tucked away on the 2nd floor, was a permanent exhibit designed to preserve the legacy of a woman I'd never heard of, Mary Anning. It wasn't so much Mary's fossil finds that intrigued me, but rather it was how this low-ranking woman had managed to make an indelible mark in such a male-dominated field. I was bowled over by how, in 1823, she successfully challenged Georges Cuvier, perhaps the most influential figure in science at the time, following her discovery of a plesiosaur. But most remarkable of all was that almost no one I knew had ever heard of Mary Anning, even among my British friends. And this was a woman London's Natural History Museum refers to on its website as the greatest fossil hunter ever known. Not only were Mary Anning's findings extraordinary, but so too was the fact that she was out of step with her times, a rebel who carved out her own niche in a highly stratified and sexist society. All around her were learned men who were trying to reconcile the gap between religious beliefs and scientific evidence, and they were using her fossil finds to do it. Indeed, it was Mary's spectacular marine reptiles that pushed them into finally contemplating a different explanation for the world's origin. Mary's many finds also lay the groundwork for Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, elucidated in his 1859 On the Origin of Species. Darwin drew on Mary's fossilized creatures as irrefutable evidence that life in the past was nothing like life in the present. Mary was deeply pious, and, like Darwin, she most likely was unsettled by what she was unearthing. She couldn't have possibly imagined where her finds would take her, and eventually Darwin and the rest of the world. Always, though, she maintained a belief in God's omnipotence. Most amazingly, this girl, with dirt under every fingernail, with barely a shilling to buy vegetables, grew up with so much confidence that in 1844 she was able to brazenly tell the King of Saxony's entourage, "I am well known throughout the whole of Europe." Here is her story. 1. Snakestones, thunderbolts, and vertebrates. On a sunny September afternoon in 1793, an adventure-seeking cabinet-maker named Richard Anning and his brooding bride Molly packed up a few trunks of belongings, all they owned in the world, and journeyed about a dozen or so miles, from the tiny village of Colliton to England's dangerously rugged coastline. They had decided to stake their future on an obscure port town they'd probably heard of in passing only a few months before, Lyme Regis. Most likely equipped with little more than an old family Bible, farm tools, a few cotton skirts and shirts, and a single waistcoat, the young couple might have paid about 10 shillings to hitch a ride on a large heavy wagon used to ferry equipment to farms dotting the bucolic borough of Dorset. Drawn by 8 horses, the vehicle would have snaked along at a tedious 2 miles an hour toward what Richard felt sure in his heart would be a prosperous future. By most descriptions, Richard Anning was a charismatic, somewhat childlike man with a passion for change and new challenges. His wife was much more serious and cynical. Richard's faith was in the Lord and in his own exhaustive energy. Molly's trust was in Richard. After nearly 2 days of weary plodding across rocky streams and bright meadows, bounced about among piles of saddles and harnesses, the bedraggled newlyweds would have heaved a huge sigh of relief when they finally caught sight of a few tightly packed houses on a hilly road, tumbling down toward a delicious little harbour, the first sight of their destiny. Mingling with the more common thatch cottages and stone barns was a sweet array of white Georgian villas, somewhat faded by decades of salt spray, but still providing a rare bright spot in what was otherwise a sobering picture. For the most part, Lyme Regis looked like an unnatural town, squashed as it was into the narrow valley of the River Lyme, bookended by miles and miles of England's most unstable coastline. With space ideally suited for a population of 800, the bowl of a village had become home to at least 1,250 mostly hard-up residents by the time Richard and Molly Anning rolled in. As a result, sanitary conditions were deplorable, with the town's compactness contributing to the rapid spread of dirt and disease. Hogs and rats ran amok in the streets, and at house after house, mounds of refuse rose up from the ground like sunflower plants, towering so high that it was hard to see out the windows. Just that summer, the Lyme courts had prosecuted a handful of citizens for allowing bullocks to defecate into clean drinking water. Indeed, the water was so filthy that many people bypassed it altogether, opting instead to quench their thirst with a watered-down ale known as small beer. Casting an invisible pall over the town were rumours that France, the dominant military power in Europe, was about to launch an invasion. Lyme Regis was right in Napoleon's line of fire. This was the new world, the great destiny, that greeted Richard Anning and his bride as they stretched achy legs, perusing a landscape that exuded commotion, but hardly the promise that should have gone with it. Most wives would have been horrified. In the most positive of lights, it was a place that would take some getting used to, even for the hardiest of characters. But where Molly might have seen barriers, cheerful Richard would have seen only opportunities. If anything, his spirits would have been buoyed just by the change of scenery. And, whether it was intelligence, intuition, or just dumb luck, Richard's instincts would turn out to be flawless. Richard's choice of Lyme Regis had been a strategic one, most likely triggered by news from friends or travellers of a new turnpike built between the nearby towns of Dorchester and Exeter, a road completed only in 1758, that was designed to pump economic life into the entire region. Until 1759, a wheeled vehicle had never passed into Lyme Regis. All goods landed at the port and were transported by pack-horse teams. The borough of Dorset also was marginalised from the rest of the country because of its very strong local dialect. The turnpike helped change all that by linking Lyme Regis to the outside world. Probably, unbeknownst to Richard when he arrived, was the fact that, with the help of the new turnpike, Lyme Regis was about to transform itself into England's guilty little pleasure. For centuries, the town had been a major commercial port. Even in the late 1700s, it was one of the most important ports in England. In particular, Lyme Regis had taken enormous pride in its man-made breakwater, one of the oldest artificial harbours in England, dating from the 13th century. Known as the Cob, which means rounded island in the local dialect, This 600-foot stone jetty, built from oaken crates topped with rounded boulders, curved out protectively like a long arm into the English Channel, shielding the location against fierce westerly storms and buffeting sea waters since medieval times. But ships were becoming too large for the town's shallow harbour, with its limited space, and so fewer were arriving each month. Once busy shipyards near the Cobb started going out of business, and over time, most trade transferred from Lyme Regis to Liverpool, a port about 250 miles away. The same ships that couldn't carry goods out also stopped bringing food in, resulting in widespread food shortages. Adding impetus to this economic downturn was a disappointing cloth trade, slammed by highly organised competition from a more industrialised north. With its plethora of weavers' homes and mills, Lyme Regis had enjoyed a booming cloth business with France as early as 1284. But the Industrial Revolution, which started in England in the mid-1700s, meant that steam-powered looms in cities farther north started churning out cloth and lace faster and cheaper than they could be crafted by hand. Coupled with war in Europe, the Industrial Revolution hammered the town's long-time economic staples. By the early 1700s, prophecies of economic doom were becoming commonplace, and many families were barely able to put food on their tables. But desirable new prospects were arising. Lyme's salvation turned out to be its clean sea air and salubrious seawater, perks the locals had long taken for granted, but that others in England, weary of the grinding noise and filth brought on by the Industrial Revolution, were now seeking with a voracious appetite. And so, the Annings were but a few drops in a stream of English travellers who were starting to discover Lyme Regis during those days. Their journeys more often than not inspired by one Richard Russell, a prominent doctor from Brighton. Russell had created a sensation in the 1750s, writing a popular treatise on the therapeutic effects of the ocean. He called it The Dissertation on the Use of Sea-Water in the Affections of the Glands. The therapy was simple enough. Complete immersion in the sea, followed by consumption of a pint of seawater. A routine he described as a common defence against corruption and putrefaction of bodies. Soon the seawater was considered a cure for everything, from gout to gonorrhea. The storm of publicity surrounding Russell's work tempted affluent tourists to travel to England's coastal villages. Even King George III, who oversaw the loss of the American colonies, was known to take long dips in the sea during retreats to Weymouth, near Lyme Regis, with the robust strains of "God Save Great George our King" blaring out from musicians on the beach, each time his portly frame descended into the water. Almost overnight, and just at the tail end of the 18th century, Lyme Regis had turned into a spa town, with its local government officials and business owners cleaning up the streets and promoting the shoreline as an economic alternative to renowned but more expensive rivals such as Weymouth, Brighton, and especially Bath. With its warm mineral springs, Bath had pioneered this new fad, although its perfect blend of entertainment and architecture had made it almost too successful, and so crowded that pleasure seekers began looking for quieter alternatives. In general, English travellers, deterred from visiting the continent due to tensions with France, were eagerly seeking holiday options that were closer to home. Coastal towns like Lyme Regis also were benefiting from the invention of a new essential for enjoying the sea, the bathing machine. Previously, anyone wishing to savour the water was obliged to undress on the beach. The new contraption, although cumbersome to use, was designed to provide cover for genteel souls for whom modesty was next to godliness. Donkeys drew to the water's edge what was essentially a wooden shed on wheels, providing a sort of hidey-hole for the bashful. By the early 1800s, 4 bathing machines were operating on the western part of Lyme Beach, with another 7 regularly plying the tranquil waters behind Lyme Regis's man-made harbour. Men and women took turns using the machines. When ladies bathed, a bell was sounded, meaning men should make themselves scarce. Even rowboats were requested to stay at least 100 yards away. It wasn't long before indoor baths became popular as well, with one of the first being built in Lyme Regis in 1804. These baths boasted not only private cubicles and tepid water, with attendants, but newspapers, refreshments, and even card game tables. They were seen as a real luxury for those who preferred not to bathe in the sea, out in the open. For nighttime entertainment, the town's chief public space, the assembly rooms, built in the late 1700s, became the place to be, the scene of fancy balls, card games, and billiards. According to resident novelist and historian John Fowles, who set his classic book, The French Lieutenant's Woman, in Lyme Regis, snobbery and backbiting reigned supreme amid the dancing, gambling, and gossiping, with young flirts and imperious old ladies fraternizing with gruff sea captains and pretentious young businessmen. The town was fortunate in that it had a major benefactor at the time, the philanthropist Thomas Hollis, who helped turn Lyme Regis into a healthy holiday resort by buying land along the shore and creating the first public promenade in 1771. A social reformer, Hollis was well known throughout Europe and America. His interest in Lyme Regis sprang from his retirement to nearby Corscombe. He purchased many of the dilapidated properties in town during the mid-1700s and rebuilt them in the elegant late Georgian style. Although he never visited America, Hollis later was known for his large donations to Harvard University. By the turn of the 19th century, even England's artists were starting to take notice of Lyme Regis, not because of the sea's benefits, but because of the region's wild and romantic coastal backdrops. Eventually the town would become a favourite haunt of James Whistler and J.M.W. Turner, both of whom completed major paintings while on holiday there. The not yet famous Jane Austen was another regular visitor to the area. Born in 1775, Austen moved with her family to Bath after her father retired as the parish rector in nearby Steventon. After a coach service was inaugurated between Bath and Lyme Regis, a journey of about 70 miles, Jane's family visited the town briefly in both 1803 and 1804, revelling in what was fast becoming a carnival atmosphere. In her novel, Persuasion, Austen famously described Lyme Regis. The walk to the Cobb, skirting around the pleasant little bay, which, in the season, is animated with bathing machines and company. The Cobb itself, its old wonders and new improvements, with the very beautiful line of cliffs, stretching out to the east of the town, are what the stranger's eye will seek. And a very strange stranger it must be who does not see charms in the immediate environs of Lyme to make him wish to know it better. Austen even had an altercation with Richard Anning during one of her visits. In a letter to her sister Cassandra, dated September 14, 1804, Jane says she asked him to repair a broken lid on a box. Apparently he said the job would cost 5 shillings. She thought the price completely outlandish, arguing that it was beyond the value of all the furniture in the room together. By all accounts, Richard Anning lost Jane's business, but it wasn't likely that he cared too much. By this time, he was focused on other lucrative ventures. Rather than apply himself to his carpentry work, as had been the original plan, he was busy signing on to another kind of life, the finding of odd-looking stones on the beach that he could sell to tourists seeking souvenirs of their seaside vacations. Since the 16th century, people had referred to most anything ferreted out of the ground, including minerals, metals and rocks, as fossils, derived from the Latin word for having been dug up. Finally, by around 1800, a few academics, mostly in Paris, began to study plant and animal fossils scientifically. The strange fossils found along Lyme Regis's shores had baffled the locals for as long as anyone could remember. They came in all forms and sizes, including what later were determined to be bivalves, ammonites, belemnites, and brachiopods, and sometimes even the fragments of giant critters never heard of before. For example, what locals called vertebrates, or crocodile teeth, actually were individual vertebrae from an unknown prehistoric creature. Lyme Bay's beaches had earned a reputation for being so full of extraordinary fossils that smugglers running ashore on pitch-black nights were able to determine their location simply by running a handful of the peculiar pebbles through their fingers. Some people thought fossils were so lovely and delicate that they surely must be God's decorations, allowed to bubble up from the inside of the earth, a bit like flowers, plants and trees were allowed to ornament the outside. Others thought they must be the remains of the victims of the worldwide flood recorded in Genesis. The belemnite fossil, known by locals as the thunderbolt, looked like an elongated bullet with an exaggerated point, and was thought to be the result of a lightning strike. Indeed, a myriad of myths and theories grew up around these and other fossils. According to one, powdered belemnites were able to clear up infections in a horse's eye. Water, in which belemnites had been soaked, was thought to be able to cure horses with worms. Called snake stones, or cornimonious in the local dialect, ammonites were believed to be particularly magical, able to ward off all sorts of maladies, from snake bites to impotence. Set in the centre of a fossil-rich coastline, extending 95 miles from Exmouth to Bournemouth, Lyme Regis's stretches of beach were, and still are, some of the most unstable expanses in the country. The cliffs' limestone ledges alternate with bands of shale, all crazily tilting toward the sea at some point, like a geological deck of cards. The mix of limestone and shale is formally known as blue lias. Blue for the blue-grey colour of the limestone, and lias from the Gaelic word for flat stone. This blue lias was, and is, constantly under siege from the rough waves. Every time a cliff face withers away, eroded by water, a rich seam of fossils is laid out, as nicely as a Sunday supper. But a fierce storm can just as easily wipe out and wash away a unique fossil before anyone can get to it. Many of Lyme Regis's most important treasures have always been tucked away tightly inside Black Ven, the ominously named 150-foot-high cliff of sliding sand, topped with scrubby grass, located east of town. Countless other strange stones are hidden inside the adjacent church cliffs, also to the east, where the limestone and shale could be reached only after the tide receded. Much later, geologists would learn that blue lias belonged to the lowest division of the Jurassic, part of the Messrs.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?